Good morning, beautiful and beloved people of God. It is such a gift and a joy for me to be invited to be with you this morning. As Jimmy said, my name is Erin Gilmore. I serve as the conference minister of the Rocky Mountain Conference of the United Church of Christ, which means I accompany already over 70 churches that are in our region of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. And so it's just a true gift. I'm thankful to Kia, to Jimmy, to everyone who's been so kind already this morning and welcoming me here. I grew up in Fort Collins, actually, and then moved to Minnesota for undergraduate degree and to Berkeley, California for my seminary degree, a master's of divinity. And following seminary, I served as a pastor of a church in Salt Lake City. And then in 2013, moved back here to Loveland to serve as the pastor of the church in downtown called First Congregational Church. And then in 2017 began this position. So my parents still live in Fort Collins, and so every time I drive from Loveland to Fort Collins, I drove by this church. And I had no idea. I just saw Crossroads, big church. I had never been inside. And then about a year ago, Ryan invited me out to coffee. And it was then that I realized what an amazing and beautiful ministry that is happening in this place. And so excited to get to meet Ryan and to be in conversation with him, to find a new colleague in Loveland. And so again, I am just deeply grateful for the invitation to be here this morning. When Ryan told me about your Lenten series and these 6 one-sentence prayers about bending, the one for today is the one that just kept leaping out at me. Bend my heart towards prayer so stress doesn't break me. And it was the word stress that kept leaping out at me. I don't know how to be alive, actually, in the 21st century and not be stressed. Is this true? As a mother, as a citizen, as a coworker, as a faith leader, as a human being, stress feels ever present, always ready to take over my life. Many, many years ago, I was in a year-long internship in seminary, and every week I would meet with my mentor. His name was Al Williams. And I remember one day, I don't remember a lot of what we talked about, but one day I came into his office, and I was just full-on in stress mode, talking about my classes, talking about my relationship, talking about all the injustices that I was overwhelmed with in the world. And when I finally took a breath, he paused, and he looked at me, and he said, "Tell me about your prayer life." Well, in full honesty, I didn't have much to say to him at the time. At that point on my spiritual journey, I had a pretty limited understanding of prayer. Growing up in the mainline tradition, I don't know if any of you have come from that tradition, but our prayers were often written for us, and they were communal prayers and part of a liturgy. And I would hear really eloquent prayers in the middle of a service. But in terms of helping me learn how to pray, that might not have been one of the stronger pieces of our upbringing. And so prayer in my early formation was really me trying to sound like the people I heard praying, talking to God, asking something of God, maybe giving thanks to God. And I had worked before going to seminary as a youth director, and I had done my own share of praying and gathering people in prayer. But to be honest, in the solitude of my own space, I didn't have what I would call a regular prayer practice. And I had even begun to question at that point my relationship to God and how I could know God and how I could hear God. And after saying as much to my mentor, he asked me, "Well, what do you think a prayer life is?" And I went on to describe, this regular moment, maybe every morning or every evening, set apart, talking to God, telling God what my feelings were, what my prayers were. And he said, yes, that can be part of prayer, but so can breath. And so can silence. And so can the word simply help. Well, in the 20 years since then, I have come to understand more of why he asked me that question that day. When we bend our hearts towards prayer, it may not take away the circumstances that create the stress, but it can change us. It can change our relationship and the way we see the thing that is causing stress. It helps us bend rather than break. I don't know about you, but when I get stressed, my view narrows. My options shrink. I don't see possibility. I lose perspective. Sometimes it's in the middle of the day when I still have 2 meetings later that evening and I'm racing to pick up my daughter from swim practice and I still don't know what we're going to eat for dinner. And I'm trying to just think about all of this and then someone squeezes in front of me in line and I'm just like, I can feel the grip on the steering wheel and I can feel my heart starting to race. And then if I can just remember, it's the just. Often it's hard. But this is the kind of stress that can be met with a breath. God is as close to me as my own breath. I can breathe, I can slow down. It doesn't change that I have things to do that night. It doesn't remove the tasks that I have to do or that I still have to figure out what's for dinner. But it softens my heart. It releases my grip, one breath at a time. If Al were to ask me now about my prayer life, I would say I'm learning to remember to breathe. In Hebrew and Greek, the word for spirit is also breath. Bending my heart towards prayer can mean bending my heart towards breath. Sometimes all the shift in perspective I need is that intentional breath, and I can move from reactive and angry to responsive. And yes, of course, come in front of me. I'm not going to get to swim practice any sooner. There is another kind of stress that I experience, and it comes after reading article after article about the fate of the planet, or seeing images on the news of the crisis in Israel and Gaza, or watching my social feed blow up with another mass shooting or a hate crime or another story of a refugee fleeing from their home. The stress that is just to be an awake human at this moment in history. There is so much pain, there is so much division, so much greed, and. I find this a more difficult kind of stress to manage. My husband and I have had many conversations about needing to go on a news diet just to be able to manage. It's too much to take in. On the one hand, it's so overwhelming. And yet, on the other, I believe that choosing to follow Jesus is choosing to abide with him, to stay awake with him, especially to the places and the people who are marginalized and oppressed and unjustly treated. And so it can be paralyzing for me. It is in these moments, especially, that my prayer takes me actually outside. I plant my feet on the earth, and I look up at the sky, and I stop and listen. I listen to all that is around me. It may be a dog barking, or a bird chirping, or a geese honking overhead, kids laughing, even the construction down the street. And I just find that in that silence of listening, the fret of everything that is in my mind settles, and slowly in that silence with God, I come back to my heart. And I can feel that tension, the attention in my head come back to my heart down here. And in that stillness, I like to imagine Jesus sitting with me, reminding me, I can't, nor is it my job to change the whole world. But he also says, remember to be open to the world. I can choose to be an agent of kindness, of generosity, of courage, wherever I am, in the grocery store, with my child, with my husband, with a friend. I can choose to listen for how I can show up today, and how I, in a moment, can embody that justice, that peace, that love that I want to see in the world. So if Al were to ask me today about my prayer life, I would tell him that I'm learning to listen for God in the silence. I'm learning to let God help me move from a mind that won't let me go to a heart that is open, giving me courage to show up in the world as best I can in the way I can on that day. And then there are still other kinds of stress. Major life event stress, the stress that comes with a diagnosis, the stress that comes with the death of a loved one, the stress of a job loss, the breaking up of a relationship, challenges at work. This past year and a half for me has actually been full of a lot of that kind of stress. I don't know that I have found myself quite literally on my knees as much as I have in the past year and a half. And my prayer for months has been, help me. This is perhaps the kind of hardest prayer for me to learn, this word help. We live in a culture that wants us to believe we can be superhuman. And I think that sometimes this interferes with how at least I have interpreted Jesus. I can easily mistake Jesus being fully human to mean that he's superhuman. But that is not actually what the scripture tells us. I find it reassuring that when we look to the Gospels, there are multiple occasions we find Jesus in prayer. Luke tells us he would withdraw to deserted places to pray. Mark tells us that after people dispersed, he would leave for the mountain to pray. Sometimes he takes his friends with him to pray. Being fully human, Jesus is fully aware of his need for help, for strength, for God to help him through. I think particularly about Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. In this intimate prayer, he says, Father, Abba, take this cup from me. Jesus knows what it is to be overwhelmed with stress, with loss, with grief, what stress he must have felt in those final days. He knew he had to rely on God. How often do I let the voices in my head tell me I need to be superhuman, that somehow I should be able to do all of this on my own? Jesus models for us what it is to be fully human. It means saying, God, help. I can't do this alone. Help. I don't know what to do. Help. Please take this cup from me. Help. Not my will, but yours. I place my life in your hands. Jesus models for us giving it all to God, placing our cares, our stress, our fears, and ultimately our trust into God's hands. That prayer gives us the muscle to do that. If Al were to ask me about my prayer life now, I would say I was learning to be vulnerable, to admit to myself and to God, I do need help, and I can't do it all on my own. These are a few of the ways that I'm learning to bend my heart towards prayer. I imagine we could sit in another hour and a half, 2 all day, and talk about more ways that prayer helps us bend rather than break. These days, I am learning how to breathe. I am learning how to listen. I am learning to ask for help. And now as friends come to me or people come to me and ask me about a prayer life, I can bear witness to the power of prayer to widen my view, to expand my perspective, and to ground me and my heart in the love and justice of Jesus. I wonder how you are bending towards prayer. What effect has prayer had on your own experiences of stress? I had a dear friend and colleague come to me at a very stressful time. She's experiencing a very stressful time in her life right now. And she told me what was happening, and we talked for close to an hour. And before we parted, she just asked me, will you pray with me? There is something so powerful about moving from talking about a situation to placing that situation in God's hands. The prayer, again, didn't take away the circumstances that were causing her stress, but it did help her know that she wasn't alone. And for that moment, I got to be a face of God, to hold that reality with her in that moment. Prayer is like that. It's this through line, this direct connection to this unending, inextinguishable presence we call the divine mystery, the love of God. In an instant, it can remind us that we are not alone, that we are part of God, that we are connected to God. We are beloved, flawed humans, and we can bring everything to God in prayer, and we can know God is as close to us as our own breath. And so this morning, I don't want to just talk about prayer. I want us to be able to pray together, to give you time also to pray. As we reflect on this verse, this prayer, bend my heart towards prayer so stress doesn't break me. We want to give time this morning to do that, to bring our prayers, our sorrows, our joys, our hopes, whatever it is that we brought here this morning, whatever is on our hearts, whatever burdens that we carry today, and create some space to be in prayer with one another and with God.